We hope you enjoyed Volume 3. Over the past couple of installments of these notes, we have looked at how to get started on a translation and how to make a fairly substantial imaginative leap in one special case. This time, I would like to give some perspective on what more ordinary translation work looks like. To begin, we will examine a passage that is fairly straightforward. You won't find big cultural or localization issues like we saw last time. This means we can concentrate on how the language itself is adapted between the Japanese and English versions. Before we get to the passage, let's talk a bit about what translation is and what it is. Translation is frequently described as falling on a scale. At one end is what is considered literal translation, which is thought to be closest to the source language. At the other end is dynamic translation, which is seen as approaching paraphrase. This means it abstracts the expression of the original text. There are often different names for these approaches, such as word-for-word versus thought-for-thought translation. These ideas are quite common. It is easy to assume that a literal translation is more faithful to the original. If it is closer to the source language, wouldn't that inherently make it a better reflection of the source text? It is an attractive idea, but we have to pause and ask ourselves in what way a literal translation is truly literal. Here is a simple Japanese sentence, not from the passage we will study. It is, Maomao ga kusari wo nonda. The natural translation for this sentence would probably be Maomao took the medicine. Although this is quite close to the meaning of the Japanese, in the strictest sense, it isn't really literal. An uncompromising reflection of the source text would look something like this. Maomao subject marker medicine object marker drank. This is because Japanese, as many of our readers will know, puts the subject at the beginning of the sentence. Any object comes in the middle and the verb is at the end. This construction is what scholars call an SOV language, subject-object-verb. English, by contrast, is an SVO language. The subject Maomao comes first, then comes the verb took. Finally, the object, the thing the verb is affecting, the medicine, comes last. You can see that even in this simple example, the literal translation has to make some concessions to the target language. For example, Japanese marks the subject and object of a sentence with special particles. This is a convention that simply doesn't exist in English. It can be indicated only by somewhat cumbersome tags. Likewise, kusari can often be translated as medicine. However, it might also be rendered as drug. This is a very common meaning in the context of the Apothecary Diaries. In English, these two words share some meanings, but they also have differences. It is up to the translator to choose the best word for each situation. Even our direct translation needed to emphasize one possible meaning over the other. You will also notice that to go from the most literal translation to something that looks remotely like something an English speaker would say, some further adjustments are required. For example, Maomao took the medicine. The order of the words has been changed to follow the normal structure of English. The verb has been translated as to take, not simply to drink. Although nomu means to drink, it can apply to both water and medicine. However, to take is the verb that modern English typically uses when someone consumes a medical drug. Such common combinations of words are called collocations. We say that take collocates with medicine. My point with this preface is simply this: the most literal possible rendering of a source language sentence is rarely the most natural or obvious. Recognizing this should remind us to be precise about what we mean and what we want when we talk about literal translation. In my opinion, the point of translation is generally to recreate the reading experience of the original in another language. So if the original text reads smoothly, the translation should as well. Because Japanese and English readers may have different ideas about what sounds smooth, this might involve rearranging the flow of the text. It could also mean adding dialogue markers to clarify who is speaking, or it might involve adding small explanations of cultural matters. For example, she sat down at the kotatsu, a small heated table, in the center of the room. To me, none of this weakens the faithfulness of the translation. In fact, I would argue that a translation which sticks too closely to the original text does a disservice to the material. This is also true if the translation relies too heavily on dictionary definitions of words, which are often considered somehow sacred. Keep these things in mind as we look at the next paragraph. Maomao found a translucent fragment on the floor. She gazed at it like a piece of concentrated candy. Then she noticed the dirt scattered across the floor. She stared at the dirt, where someone had desperately tried to wipe it away. Suddenly she thought the dirt seemed to increase as she moved closer to the wall. Nitsumeta observed the rain-like substance intently. Then she noticed a scattering of dirt on the floor. She stared at the dirt, marked by traces of someone having hastily gathered it. Suddenly she thought the dirt increased as she approached the wall. Maomao discovered semi-translucent shards on the floor. She looked hard at the shards like hard-boiled candy. Then she noticed the stippling stains on the floor. She looked closely at those stains, and she saw traces of desperate wiping, as if someone had hoped to remove them. Suddenly, it seemed to her that the stains were increasing as they got closer to the wall. All of this sounds perfectly ordinary and quite readable in Japanese. My goal in presenting the English in this more direct form is to show that an unadapted translation turns a smooth piece of Japanese narration into something awkward and sometimes hard to follow. You might notice that even for what I call an unadapted translation, I still had to make some decisions about the language. For example, Japanese nouns do not show whether they are singular or plural by default, so it is not always obvious whether Maomao discovers one shard or several on the floor. The same is true of the yogor, which could be a stain or stains. However, the fact that they are said to be increasing in number makes it clear that there is more than one of them. I also chose to use the word discover to translate Mitsukuru. The characters for Mitsukuru literally mean to see and latch onto, or in a more idiomatic way, to catch the eye. I did not choose find or spot. Thus we can already see that the translation does not involve a simple one-to-one correspondence between words in the two languages. This is how a dictionary can sometimes make it appear. Instead, each word covers a particular range of meanings. What the translator does is find that same range of meanings in the target language and select a word that conveys the most appropriate one or ones. On some level, they are asking themselves if the author had written exactly this same scene, but was a native English speaker, what words would they have used? The answer will be somewhat subjective, of course, but it is not completely arbitrary. Here is my final version of the translation for this passage. She noticed some small, semi-translucent shards on the floor. They looked like hard candy. She stared at them intently. Then there was a trail of discolorations on the floor as well. It looked as though someone had tried desperately to wipe them away. She studied those discolorations too, and began to think there were more of them closer to the wall. I decided to translate Mitsukuru as notice. I used the word discover a little later in the same scene, and I did not want to repeat the word. I also found some different ways of expressing the idea of looking closely at an object, which comes up a couple of times in this paragraph. I would especially like to highlight what has happened to the sentences themselves. Both the Japanese paragraph and my final version contain 5 sentences, but the material within them is arranged somewhat differently. For instance, the Japanese passage begins by introducing the semi-translucent shards. Then, it moves on to a separate sentence describing the shards and using a pronoun to refer to them. This approach feels a bit stunted in English, and perhaps even a little redundant. Repetition is common in Japanese writing, but it is often less desirable in English. Therefore, I have moved the description of the shards they were like hard candy to the moment they are first mentioned. This feels more natural for description in English. In the 4th sentence of the original Japanese paragraph, I did the opposite. The yogor, or stains and discolorations, are described with a lengthy adjective clause. In Japanese, descriptive clauses usually come before the noun they describe, so the sentence literally says she looked at discolorations showing signs of having been desperately wiped at in hopes of getting rid of them. This is perfectly normal Japanese grammar, but it sounds awkward in English. Instead, I described the discolorations in one sentence. It looked like someone had tried desperately to wipe them away. Then I split the verb into the next sentence. She studied those too. Look at the 3rd sentence in the Japanese paragraph. It says soshate, toko nai kairahora to aru yogor. You can see that this sentence does not have a verb in the first translation. This is quite standard in Japanese. It is called teijin dome, which means noun stop, or more simply, ending a sentence with a noun. As a translator, I am considering the rhetorical effect at this point. The discolorations suddenly come to our attention in this way. It feels almost cinematic. In English, we usually need a verb in each sentence, but what if a sentence wasn't complete? I used then, there to show where Maomao's attention shifted. This brings the reader along with her. I also used a colon to help move past where a verb might normally be. I decided on the word discolorations for yogor. Although I have used stains as a substitute when rendering it once or twice in this essay, the term covers a range of grime marks. I thought discolorations was more general. Maomao might not know exactly where they come from yet, and they might or might not even be stains in the strictest sense. The longer word also gives the sentence a nice rhythm. Finally, what has become a futo at the beginning of the final Japanese sentence? The word means something like suddenly or abruptly. Japanese has a wide range of words with these meanings and employs them liberally. To be perfectly honest, sometimes the best thing to do in terms of English style is simply to gloss over them. In some cases, they seem to mean less that XYZ happened suddenly than simply that XYZ happened next. This sequence is often already implied by the narration itself. In this case, as I said, I added the verb from the previous Japanese sentence to what becomes the final English sentence. I let the momentum account for the continued shift in Maomao's attention, so now you know what goes into translating a relatively straightforward paragraph. It is also interesting that the same paragraph appears in both English and Japanese. This is not always the case, because Japanese handles the flow of thought and narration differently. Creating meaningful paragraphs in English often requires combining separate lines or paragraphs from the Japanese version. As I have said before, doing this does not take as long in practice as it does to write out all the steps. However, there are times when I have to stop and think about the best vocabulary choice or the best way to structure a sequence of sentences. This is where the editor is especially helpful. Sasha often helps me see when I have kept too much of the original Japanese flow. We can make things smoother in English by rearranging or combining parts of sentences or paragraphs. Perhaps the most useful thing I have learned from this experience is that translation always involves some interpretation. For example, which synonym should be used for Mitsukaru? How should the details from the original text be presented to achieve the best effect in English? This interpretation is not without limits. The translator is always considering the original text. They are thinking about the vocabulary choices, the dramatic or rhetorical effect, and the intended meaning. These points then affect how the material is presented in English. Hopefully, this gives you a better understanding of what happens during translation. It can also help you think more clearly and precisely about what you want from a translation and how you believe it should handle the original text. Have fun, read widely, and we will see you next volume. Sign up for our mailing list at J Novel Club to hear about new releases. Newsletter. You can also read the latest chapters like Volume 4 of this series by becoming a J Novel Club member. J Novel Club membership. Copyright The Apothecary Diaries Volume 3 by Natsu Hyuga. Illustrations by Tauko Shino. Translated by Kevin Steinbach. Edited by Sasha McGlynn. This book is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual events, locales, or persons, living or dead, is coincidental. Kyusuri no Hitaragoto. Copyright Natsu Hyuga 2015. All rights reserved. Originally published in Japan by Shufunatomo Infos Co., Ltd. Through Shufunatomo Co., Ltd. This English edition is published by arrangement with Shufunatomo Co., Ltd. of Tokyo. English translation copyright 2021, J Novel Club LLC, all rights reserved. In accordance with the U.S. Copyright Act of 1976, scanning, uploading, and electronically sharing any part of this book without the publisher's permission is unlawful piracy and theft of the author's intellectual property. J Novel Club LLC. J Novel Club. The publisher is not responsible for websites or their content that are not owned by the publisher. This ebook edition is 10 from September 2021.